Welcome to Prison Professors. I am Michael Santos with episode number 2. I'm so thrilled to introduce you to my partner and good friend, Shon Hopwood. Shon, welcome to the program. Would you please start off by telling our audience what you're doing right now with your life?
I am co-founder of Prison Professors and am an associate law professor at Georgetown University Law Center. I'm a law professor.
The cool thing about Shon's story is he really embodies this message that regardless of what you've done in the past or where you've come from, you can achieve a high level of potential and success. And he really is the poster child for success after prison, which is why I'm so thrilled to be working with him in Prison Professors. And we are going to devote this entire second episode to learning about Shon's incredible journey and story. Many of you may have seen it before on 60 Minutes, but we will have this interactive approach right now. So Shon, tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what led to you going into the prison system.
I grew up in a rural town in Nebraska of 2,500 people. I lived there for most of my life. I got out of high school and went to college and was kicked out because I didn't go to school. I then went to the Navy for 2 years and came home and really had no purpose in my life. Had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and I started running around with a group of guys that were drug dealers, and one bad decision after another, and I ended up robbing 5 banks.
Shon, did you have any history at all of substance abuse of any kind that may have influenced the decisions you were making as a young man?
No, I mean, most of the substance abuse happened after I robbed the first bank to try and forget about the bad things I had done. It was mostly just young 20 foolishness.
What kind of substance abuse complicated your decision making?
Oh, I used all sorts of drugs.
So when you went into the prison system after you were arrested for robbing multiple banks, did you go into the prison system with any concept or idea of what you'd be doing with your life while you were in prison and what you'd be doing when you got out of prison?
I had no idea. What I did know was when I got to prison, I didn't like it. There was nothing I liked about it. I would watch as guys would come in for a couple years, go out for a couple years. We called it doing life on the installment plan. And the thing I knew I wanted more than anything was to get out and never come back to prison. And so I knew I had to find something that was going to be applicable to the outside world, some sort of job skill. And I just happened to luck into a job in the prison law library, and it changed my life.
So when you went to work at the prison law library, what was your education level like at that time in your life?
I had been to undergraduate college on a basketball scholarship for about 4 or 5 months. That was it. One semester in which I didn't go to school or class very often.
So you did well enough in high school to at least begin a career in college, but it doesn't sound like you had much of a appetite for scholarly studies. Is that right?
That's correct. And I was a horrible student in high school, straight C student, and never really enjoyed going to class and learning or anything academic in nature until I found the law.
And when you said you found the law, walk our audience, many of whom may have been in prison or some of whom may have never been to prison but may be on the way there. What does that mean? How do you find the law while you're in prison?
Well, the first couple months, I didn't do much with the law other than check out books. The books were very big and thick and intimidating, and when I did pull one down and try to read it, it felt like it was written in another language. And so I wanted nothing to do with the law other than I enjoyed the job of checking out the books. And then June 26th of 2000 happened. The U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision called Apprendi v. New Jersey. I, along with every other federal prisoner in the country, thought that this could lead to a sentence reduction. So for the first time in my life, I had a lot of motivation to try and study the law. And that's what I did. I studied for 2 months and eventually typed up a brief that I pecked out on a prison typewriter and sent it off to the courts.
Well, you said that you learned about this case in 2006, a very famous case, historical case of Paperny versus New Jersey, right?
Yep, in 2000.
Oh, it was in 2000. So it was in 2000 when you learned about that case. How long had you been working in the law library when this monumental case came down?
About 6 months.
So you only had about 6 months. You learned about the case. You said that you filed a brief. What was the result?
The first time I sent it in, the court sent it back to me and said, Mr. Hopwood, you should really file this in the correct court. So the start of my legal career began with a legal brief I typed on a prison typewriter that I sent to the wrong court. Eventually, I filed it in the correct court, and my sentencing judge, Judge Richard G. Cuff, promptly denied it and said that basically I could not get any legal relief.
And how did that disappointing news influence your perception of being in prison while serving as sentences for 5 armed bank robberies?
Well, anytime you lose a chance of getting home sooner, it's an incredible disappointment. But what I found was during this process, I really enjoyed the process of solving these legal puzzles and then writing out the solution. And so while I was never able to get any legal relief for myself, I started helping other guys who were indigent and whose lawyers were on. They were on direct appeal and they had lawyers, and I was sending memos to the lawyers pointing out issues I thought that they should raise.
Now, you'd mentioned that you had a lot of motivation to study the law while you were in prison because this case came down, and certainly I remember that case coming down, and you're absolutely right. Every person in prison had a lot of hope with that case, but not every person in prison devoted the level of time and energy that would have taken to begin learning the law and learning how to use the law as a tool. What guidance or what observations or comments do you have about people who say, I've got a lot of motivation to do something versus people who actually do it when they're in the prison system?
Yeah, what's funny is looking back at it now, and after having read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, it makes a lot of sense why I had success. What Malcolm Gladwell says is that people can master something if they spend 10 years diligently learning or doing one thing. And for me, that was the law. I was taking books home every night and reading Federal Reporter, which is a compendium of Federal Court of Appeals decisions. I would take those books to my cell at night and just read them like a novel. And I read probably 3,000 or 4,000 judicial opinions in those 10 years. And that has served me well ever since.
Did you set goals while you were going through those books of reading a certain quantity of cases every week or every month? Could you tell us a little bit about how goal setting may have influenced your journey of going through a lengthy prison term?
Yeah, so I had goals of reading so many books a year, and I had goals of reading so many cases a year. And I would keep track, usually on just a piece of scrap paper. I would keep track of the opinions that I had read that day. And then my other goal was eventually I started writing briefs for other prisoners, and the goal was to win at least 1 or 2 cases a year, which, as someone filing as a pro se indigent petitioner in federal court, 1 or 2 wins a year is a lot, because those don't come around very often.
And you started winning 1 or 2 cases, or perhaps many more cases as those years turned. And one of them really brought a life-changing event for you. And I know that it's written about, it's widely publicized. But, as a partner of yours, I'd love it if you told our audience about that extraordinary event.
Yeah, so I was serving time at FCI Pekin in Pekin, Illinois. I had caught my case in Nebraska, but there are no federal prisons in Nebraska. A lot of guys at the prison I was at were from Illinois, and then John Fellers came to my unit, and John was from Lincoln, Nebraska, same town I was living in when I was arrested. And he came to me one day and said, you know, I just lost my appeal in the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and my lawyer says I have no chance at getting the Supreme Court to grant review in this case. However, Shon, he wants too much money. Would you be willing to file the cert petition? And at first I said no. I had been filing pro se habeas petitions to federal district courts, but had done nothing in the U.S. Supreme Court. And I didn't know a great deal about the court, but I did know that filing a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court is a much different matter. The court, unlike every other court, does not have to hear your case. And the Supreme Court receives on average around 7,000 to 8,000 petitions a year. They grant around 80 of those, which means you've got about a 1% chance of having your case heard. That 1% chance is for lawyers filing briefs. That's not for indigent, pro se federal prisoners filing a brief that's pecked out on a typewriter to the court. The court grants one of those cases about every 10 years, and the chances of winning and getting a case like that heard is about 1% of 1%. So I knew we were up against long odds, but John was very persuasive and eventually talked me into it, and we filed his cert petition. And then John transferred to another prison, and I largely forgot about John and his case. That is, till one morning I was headed to the recreation yard when a friend of mine came running and screaming out of the housing unit. And what he had was a copy of the USA Today in his hands, and it said that the Supreme Court had granted John Feller's case. How unlikely that was, given he had not filed with an attorney, and it even quoted a couple of the sentences from the brief that I had prepared on a prison typewriter.
So you have been helping people in prison since while you were still going through prison, but winning a case or winning the opportunity to have the United States Supreme Court hear a case is not really the end. You had to continue. And tell us a little bit more what happened after you learned that the Supreme Court agreed to hear your case or hear this case of John Feller.
I've done everything in my life backwards. Usually getting a case granted by the Supreme Court is the very pinnacle of the legal profession and for lawyers. It is an accomplishment that lawyers spend their whole lives trying to get. And, you know, it happened for me on the first time. That was the first brief I had really ever, I think, the first brief I had ever filed in a appellate capacity. And it was the first brief I had filed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the court was not, once we got the review granted, the court was not going to fly me from FCI Pekin in orange jumpsuit and handcuffs and belly chains to go argue the case before the Supreme Court. So we needed a lawyer to take the case. And John became the most famous prisoner in America for a day. The day after his case was granted, every lawyer was calling the prison wanting to take the case pro bono so that they could argue it. John was smart enough to realize, maybe I don't want the lawyers that are calling, maybe I want the lawyer that is not calling. And he found out from another lawyer that he should contact Seth Waxman. Seth was the former Solicitor General of the United States during the Clinton administration and is now in private practice at one of the largest firms in the world, WilmerHale. And Seth agreed to take the case. And unlike most people with Seth's pedigree, this guy went to Harvard undergrad, Yale Law School, clerked for a federal judge, went to the Department of Justice, eventually becoming Solicitor General of the United States. I think most people in Seth's position would have said, hey, Mr. Jailhouse Lawyer, great job getting the case granted, but I'll take it from here. And yet that is the exact opposite of how Seth acted. He and WilmerHale made me a part of the team, sent in drafts of the briefs for me to mark up, provide notes, and send back. And we also had a couple conference calls on my prison counselor's phone, which I don't think is the norm.
It is certainly not the norm, but it certainly should give hope to anybody who is going into the criminal justice system that when you're spinning out of control and feeling that your life is over, we can look to a story like the inspiring story of Shon Hopwood and recognize, hey, this is not the last chapter of my life. I can begin sowing seeds today for an outcome that maybe I can't even comprehend right now. We're talking to Shon Hopwood, a former individual who had some struggles as a young man, went to federal prison for armed bank robbery, and now he is one of the most distinguished appellate lawyers and professors of law in the United States. And he's sharing the story with us that it should be a measure of hope for anybody who is going into the criminal justice system, or anybody who may be in there right now, helping, hopefully giving them some hope that regardless of what you're going through, you can start sowing seeds today for a better outcome. And that happened very early on during your story and your journey, Shon. Tell us how working with Seth Waxman and the United States Supreme Court influenced the rest of your journey through prison.
Well, if the Supreme Court doesn't grant that case, I don't know that I continue doing the law. It's very difficult to win cases as a pro se litigant in federal prison, and it is very depressing when you have meritorious claims, but you don't feel like the courts have given you justice because you've not filed with a lawyer. And so that really jump-started my career. And what I found was using my skills to help other people really changed my life and changed my trajectory. And part of changing that directory was also Seth Waxman and the law firm of Wilmer Hale. Because long after the case, John Feller's case was over and we won 9-0, and John actually gets resentenced and ends up beating me home, Seth and the lawyers at Wilmer Hale remain in contact with me and have been good mentors to me, to the point where 2-3 weeks ago, I accepted an award from the Bar Association of the District of Columbia for the Young Lawyer of the Year award. And who introduced me but Seth Waxman?
What an incredible honor.
Yeah, we sat at the table with he and his wife, Debbie, and it felt like things had come full circle.
But going through, you won the Supreme Court case relatively early, or you had a role in winning that Supreme Court case relatively early during your prison journey. How many more years did you have to serve before you were able to begin taking the next steps in your career?
Yeah, so John Feller's case was decided in 2003, and I still had another 5 years left to do. And so I really just dove into the law head first. At one point, I was representing anywhere from 10 to 12 people at once in courts all over the country. And, I had some other successes. I got the Supreme Court to grant yet another case. I had a good friend of mine, Melvin Brown, who was a 22-year-old African-American man who had received 16 and a half years for less than a handful of crack cocaine. And we found that his lawyer had made pretty significant errors at sentencing, and he was taken back and resentenced to 5 years and 8 months. And Melvin had bought me a $6 typewriter ribbon and a $6 copy card to use in his case. So for $12, he got over 10 years off of his sentence.
And you got a second Supreme Court victory.
And a second Supreme Court victory. And then I started winning cases all over the place. Right up to the point that I was released to a halfway house in October of 2008.
And so October of 2008, you conclude a decade in prison and you return to your community. Was it in Nebraska?
It was. The halfway house was in Council Bluffs, Iowa, across the river from Omaha, Nebraska.
And what was that adjustment like after more than a decade in federal prison?
Well, the first month was just really, I'm not one that worries or gets into panic, but I had a lot of anxiety that first month just because, I had never been on the internet. I'd never seen an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod. Technology scared me, as did the level of choice. I remember one day being stuck in a Walmart because I was staring at an entire shelf of toothpaste and didn't know which one to pick because I had never had such choices while I was in federal prison. But eventually that went away, and it was 2008, 2009. This was the height of the recession. No one was finding work, let alone the guy that just did 11 years for robbing a bunch of banks, and I struggled to find employment. But eventually Cockle Legal Briefs, in part because of Seth Waxman and the other lawyers, Noah Levine at Wilmer Hale, who gave me good references. Eventually, I got this job at Cockle Legal Briefs that I got to help lawyers all over the country file briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this business just happened to be located in downtown Omaha.
And that role at Cockle Legal Briefs led to some more exciting developments in your return to society. And I'd love for you to share with us what happened.
Yeah, so I worked on a criminal case involving the Confrontation Clause with a law professor from the University of Michigan Law School named Rich Friedman. Rich asked if I was a lawyer. I said no. I then told him my story. And when he argued his case to the U.S. Supreme Court, he was interviewed afterwards by Adam Liptak from the New York Times. And he said, "Adam, I just got this amazing story for you." And Adam called me a few weeks later and published an article in the Times in February of 2010. And my life and my family's life has not been the same ever since. That one little New York Times article led to a host of really wonderful opportunities, including a book deal with Random House, a trip to go speak at Harvard University, and eventually law school.
So what we're listening in the story of Shon Hopwood is really, I think, a tale that is helpful to anybody who's listening. And this is what my takeaway is from that, is that the decisions that we make in prison can put us on a path for a phenomenal life. But when we come back to society, that doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to be easy. There's always going to be struggle in our life. And Shon described some struggle that he was facing in spite of winning 2 cases in the Supreme Court and cases across the country. He still found some challenges getting employment until the mentors that he developed in prison helped open opportunities for him with Cockle Briefs. And that really started to accelerate his success with a New York Times article and invitations to Harvard, and then scholarships to go to law school from, who gave you your scholarships, Shon?
The Gates Public Service Law program at the University of Washington School of Law.
And your first job after law school, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I had thought long and hard about what I wanted to do coming out of law school, and I thought it would be kind of neat to go work as a law clerk for a federal judge on the federal courts of appeals. So I applied to judges all over the country, and one judge in particular, Judge Janice Rogers Brown of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, said yes and hired me as a law clerk on the D.C. Circuit, which is widely considered to be the second most important court in the country, behind only the U.S. Supreme Court.
And how many people in law schools across the country aspire to a clerkship like that within on the D.C. Circuit Court or on any court of appeals?
Yeah, I mean, it's the elite of the elite. When I worked for Judge Brown, we received around 600 applications for 4 law clerk positions. And these applications came from students at Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Columbia and NYU and the University of Chicago. And the resumes were nothing short of spectacular. People that had worked at the White House, worked on Capitol Hill, people that had worked in Africa, people that had done Teach for America, and then gone to Yale Law School. What I realized was how fortunate I was to get that job working for Judge Brown.
The harder we work, the luckier we become, Shon. You are certainly evidence of that, and the embodiment of that maxim that you work hard and opportunities open. And many people may listen to Shon's story and say how lucky he is, but at the end of the day, if it happened one time, then perhaps we could attribute it to luck. But really, what Shon shows us is that if you apply yourself every single day with 100% commitment, and you really devote yourself to a pursuit of excellence, you can become something different from what anybody expects to come out of federal prison. And Shon, you went on from the D.C. Circuit Court to continue this extraordinary path, and it would be awesome if you told our audience about that.
Yeah, you're right, Michael. I always find that if I do the hard work and I show people I have changed, and they see how hard a worker I am, and they see that I have the skills to do the job, it's amazing to me how many doors open up. and where those doors open up. You would have never convinced me prior to going to law school, or even when I was in law school, that I would get a clerkship at the DC Circuit. I think my law school has had one other person go to clerk there in the last 20 years. And so these were opportunities that seemed beyond my reach. And yet I was able to accomplish it in part because I think people saw what I could bring to the table, and they saw I could bring value. And that carried over to when I was applying for jobs while I was clerking. And one of the jobs I applied to was for a teaching fellow, to be a teaching fellow at Georgetown in the appellate litigation program. And the director, who had been there for 35 years, called me in for an interview and called my references and called me back and said, you know, I never thought I would be hiring a former bank robber, but I would like to offer you this job, and I think it would be a whole lot of fun to have you around for 2 years. And together, his name's Steve Goldblatt, together we litigated a whole lot of appeals over the course of 2 years and had quite a bit of success, given that the cases we had were incredibly difficult.
What Shon shows us is that even if you think that you've reached the top, the pinnacle, and he's done that numerous times, winning a Supreme Court case, getting a scholarship from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, getting hired at the DC Circuit Court, you can always reach higher. And he reached higher and found himself opening brand new opportunities at one that he thought may have been beyond him. But that's not all. Continue,
Yep.
Shon.
Well, then I decided that out of all of the careers I could go into, that maybe trying to become a law professor, a tenure-track law professor, would be the best career move for me, for a number of reasons. One, I really enjoyed teaching during my 2 years as a teaching fellow. Two, I wanted a job where I have time to write about issues that I care about in the criminal justice system. As a professor and as a scholar, I get to do that. And I also get to litigate cases where I think I can make a difference in the criminal justice system. And then on top of it, I wanted a position somewhere where I could do criminal justice reform. And Georgetown is uniquely situated, given that it is the top law school in Washington, D.C. My office is 3 blocks from Capitol Hill. And ironically enough, my office is a single block from the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I walk past that building daily.
Well, I've walked there with you.
Yeah, you and I have walked there together. And, you know, I have a lot of pinch me moments during my time at Georgetown, and the law school gives me a platform to talk about issues involving criminal justice reform. And so it's uniquely perfect job for me. So I went on the teaching market and interviewed with a lot of law schools, but Georgetown made an offer, and there is no law school in the country I would have chose over Georgetown.
You know, what we hear in Shon's story also is this incredible humility. His goal is always to serve others, and through serving others, he finds himself having more liberty in his own life. And so we can use this as a teaching tool for people who are going into the prison system, who are living without hope. I heard him say that he found that hope when he started striving to help others. And I can tell you it's a great honor for me to share his story, but I'm not the only one who found incredible inspiration in Shon's story. After he got appointed to Georgetown, the national media became interested in him. And some of you, as I said, may have watched him because we know how many millions of people did. Tell us a little bit about that experience, Shon.
Yeah, so when I got my job from Georgetown, there was a lot of media that contacted me, and it led to a front page article in the Washington Post, which a lot of people read, including one person in particular named Steve Croft, who is a longtime correspondent for 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes contacted me, and we spent this summer filming. I'm always amazed at how long they film for a 14-minute piece. I think we filmed over 30-some hours. And in October, I was on 60 Minutes, and it was in an episode that was viewed by 13.4 million people on a Sunday night. which is just shocking to me.
13.4 million people saw the incredible story of Shon Hopwood, and that's what our team at Prison Professors strives to offer. I am so proud of Shon for co-founding this organization with Justin Paperny and me, and you will hear about Justin in episode 3. But what I also want to show is the difference between Prison Professors and many of the other episodes that talk about prison. We don't profile this pathway that leads people into struggle and darkness. I want to highlight Shon's story as an example of hope and brightness and what the best possible outcome from our prison system can be. Shon is living proof of that, and I just feel incredibly honored that he has chosen to work with us, and we will continue using his story to influence policy and change, but also to help people prepare for the best possible outcome in prison and sentencing and every other area. Shon, do you have any final words as we come to the end of this episode number 2 for our audience?
Well, you always talk about how my story inspires you, but Michael, you're inspiring to me. I think if I had done 26 straight years in prison, I would have come out of prison incredibly bitter and angry at the world. And I have never seen you act that way. Instead, I see you incredibly grateful for all of the opportunities you have. And I just love to be around people like that. You inspire me, and, together I hope that we're going to change this criminal justice system. Even if we don't get any other laws changed, we can change prisoners from the inside so that when they come out, they're ready to tackle the struggles and the successes of the world.
We're going to help get more people into success from struggle. That is our mission at Prison Professors. Tomorrow's episode will be with Justin Paperny, our co-founder, and then we will be presenting a series of episodes with strategies that people can use. We will also be sharing lessons that we have created, and we will feature an abundance of interviews with other inspiring people. So I want to thank you all for listening to our second episode of Prison Professors. I want to thank Shon Hopwood, my partner and co-founder, and we will work hard to prove worthy of your attention. Thanks so much. I am Michael Santos with Prison Professors featuring Shon Hopwood. Thank you.